Last time we learned about the hierarchy of life that organizes all of the organisms on this planet into different nested hierarchies. Well, what is that called? It's actually got a name named after a man who popularized this careful way of putting organisms into groups. His name was Carl Linnaeus. He was from Sweden. And in 1735, he introduced a particular naming system that had 5 levels. First, he had kingdoms, which we talked about last time. Then he had class, order, genus, and species. That's how he named them. He took the last 2, genus and species, and used them to create what's called the binary naming system or binomial naming system. So if you're talking about a human, for example, you would say a Homo sapien, okay? Because Homo is the genus and sapien is the species. And it's always in Latin because that's the kind of thing they were doing back then. And it's a very powerful and convenient system because it keeps everything distinct from one another. It's like having a unique email address that nobody else has, so that when somebody sends an email address to that email address, it only goes to you or to the person it's intended for. Similarly, these combination of those names in the genus and species level are unique to every organism on the planet. Now what I found interesting as I was learning about Linnaeus is that that it was not unusual for any language system. Obviously, Carl spoke Swedish, and other people spoke other languages at the time, and they all had and continue to have what are called folk taxonomies that break everything in the living world into levels. So, for example, you might talk about whether something's a plant or an animal or something else. If you pick plant, you still need to know, well, is it a plant I might find in my vegetable garden or out in the fields or in the forest? So, it's a vegetable. Well, if I know it's a vegetable, is it a bean or is it some sort of a root or is it something else? Oh, it's a bean. Well, what kind of bean is it? Is it a lima bean or is it a string bean or something? Oh, it's a lima bean. And what kind of lima bean? It's a baby lima bean. So that's an example of plant, vegetable, bean, lima, baby lima. So those are the different 5 categories. And it turns out most folk taxonomies have 5 levels to them. So what Carl came up with the kingdom, class, order, genus, species, with its 5 levels was not that different from what everybody else was doing. Now, how did we get more than 5 levels? Because we certainly have more than 5 levels now. It's been a gradual building process. For example, in 1817, roughly 100 years later, Georges Cuvier, a Frenchman, added phylum, and that became very popular between kingdom and class. Family was something that Linnaeus himself used as a synonym for class, but in 1906, botanists adopted it below the level of class as a separate category, and now we have it there. And just in 1990, Carl Woese came up with the 3 domains that we learned about last night that are really right at the top and appear to be very distinct, these 3 domains that separate life into really 3 very different categories. And as I mentioned last time, some people aren't happy about having nothing between domain and kingdom. So people are arguing about what should be next in between there. So this is an ongoing process of breaking everything in life into its own little category. And it's very exciting and interesting to try to understand what makes something similar and should be in the same category and what should be different. I think, though, to really understand this, you should do it yourself. So one activity you could do is think of your favorite organism. For me, it's pretty simple. I like the common octopus. The common octopus is intelligent. It moves around. It's got camouflage. It's all sorts of good stuff. And the activity that I think you should do with your favorite organism is to find out how it's organized in the great hierarchy, the Linnaean hierarchy of life. For example, the octopus, not surprisingly, is in the domain of eukaryota because it has a nucleus inside of itself. It's also in the kingdom of Animalia, which means it's an animal. I wasn't surprised to learn that it is in the phylum Mollusca because it's a mollusk. It's the most intelligent mollusk. And then I was wondering, well, where does it become an octopus? In the class Cephalopoda, it's not an octopus yet because I know that includes things like squid, cuttlefish, stuff like that. But in the order, that's when it becomes an octopus. All octopuses are in the same order. That's where they've all been grouped together. So when you go below the level of order to like family and genus and species, that's just what type of octopus it is. So the common octopus is in the family of Octopodiae and in the genus Octopus. And my favorite one, the common octopus, is in the species Vulgaris, which is Latin for common. So if you wanted to talk about the binomial name, binary name for octopus, the common octopus, you would say Octopus vulgaris, or O vulgaris for short. Just like E. coli is Escherichia coli, and you probably more often hear about E. coli infections at fast food restaurants than you do about Escherichia coli infections. So that's often a very common way to do it. And if you're done figuring out what your favorite organism is, that's great, good job. You might want to compare it to something very similar. So for me, I once heard about an octopus that could walk on two hind legs that often did that. It's called the coconut octopus. It balls itself up like a coconut and uses its tiny two little back legs to move it like a drifting coconut on the seafloor. This coconut octopus is in the same family as the common octopus, but in a different genus, and of course then a different species. So I was curious to find out what it was like. Now, this activity just kind of gives you an appreciation for all the multiple levels. You'll see on Wikipedia that there are subfamilies, superfamilies, all kinds of stuff, and you'll understand that this is a dynamic field. People are constantly inventing new levels above levels just to divide things up more rigorously. If we come back to a picture of Uno's cube that we learned about last time, again, the left face is where we would put this wonderful hierarchy of life with life at the top and domains and etc. In the cube that you probably see most of Uno's cube, there are the kingdom is shown. But just keep in mind that even though the kingdom levels with animals, plants, fungi, protista, and all that stuff, each one of those can be divided further into little levels. So remember that face has the possibility of being divided into more and more thin levels. And we'll talk about that more later. But this cube, as we learn about the three different sides, the X, the Y, and the Z, will really help you organize biology in your mind. And if you want to take this to the next level, I encourage you to read from the BioBook, The Leaf, what are the different levels at which scientists can explore the natural world. So this leaf really focuses on the levels of organization side, the left side of Uno's cube, which is what we're learning about in this lecture. And in the next lecture, we'll look more closely at this cube and how the three facets fit together.